Emily was a quiet child with a love for dolls. Her collection was vast, ranging from porcelain dolls with cracked faces to stuffed cloth ones with button eyes. Each doll had a story, each one had a past. To Emily, they were more than just toys, they were her friends, each with a unique personality. Her favorite was a delicate porcelain doll with blue eyes and golden curls, which she named Clara. Clara always sat on the highest shelf, looking over the rest of the collection like a silent guardian. One evening, as Emily was about to drift off to sleep, she heard it, a faint, almost inaudible whisper. She sat up, scanning her room in the dim light. The whispering stopped. She thought it was her imagination playing tricks on her, so she lay back down. But just as she was closing her eyes, the whispering began again, soft and rhythmic like a distant chant. It seemed to be coming from her dolls. Emily's heart raced as she pulled the covers over her head, trying to drown out the sound. Eventually, the whispers faded, and she fell into an uneasy sleep. The next morning, Emily decided to investigate. She approached her dolls with caution, inspecting each one closely. They all looked the same, with their frozen smiles and lifeless eyes. She shook her head, laughing nervously at her own fear. "It's just a dream," she told herself, "just my imagination." But as she turned to leave, she thought she heard a faint giggle, a childlike sound that sent a shiver down her spine. Days went by, and the whispers became a regular occurrence. They were always soft, always just on the edge of her hearing. At first, they were just noises, gibberish that she couldn't understand. But soon, she began to hear words, faint and disjointed, like fragments of a long-lost conversation. "Come, play, forever." The words echoed in her mind, growing louder each night. Emily tried to ignore them, burying herself in books and schoolwork, but the whispers were persistent, creeping into her thoughts and dreams. One night, as Emily lay in bed, she heard the whispers more clearly than ever before. "We see you, Emily," they said in a sing-song voice. Her eyes snapped open, and she sat up in bed, her heart pounding. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling. The room was still, save for the moonlight casting eerie shadows on the walls. The whispers stopped, leaving an unsettling silence in their wake. Emily hugged her knees to her chest, staring at her dolls with wide, fearful eyes. She knew then that something was very, very wrong. The whispers became a relentless torment, haunting Emily at every turn. She would hear them in the stillness of the night, in the quiet moments of the day, even when she was at school. The once comforting presence of her dolls now filled her with a deep, gnawing dread. She tried to tell herself they were just toys, that it was all in her head, but the whispers kept pushing, prodding at the edges of her sanity. Emily's parents noticed the change in her. She was no longer the cheerful, imaginative girl they knew. She became withdrawn, her once bright eyes now dull and filled with unease. Her schoolwork suffered, and she stopped inviting friends over, preferring to stay locked away in her room. When they asked her what was wrong, she would just shake her head, afraid to speak of the voices that haunted her. "It's nothing," she would mutter, her voice barely a whisper. But in the back of her mind, she knew it was far from nothing. The whispers grew bolder, no longer content to stay in the shadows of her mind. They started speaking of things no child should know, dark, twisted things about the afterlife, about a place filled with shadows and eternal torment. Emily would lie awake at night, tears streaming down her face, as the voices described scenes of despair and suffering. They spoke of people trapped in darkness, unable to move on, their voices echoing in an endless void. The more she heard, the more she realized these weren't just random words. They were stories, each more horrifying than the last, each etched into her memory like a scar. Desperate for help, Emily confided in her parents. She told them everything: the whispers, the visions, the strange things happening in her room. But her parents, rational and skeptical, dismissed her fears as mere nightmares. "It's just your imagination, sweetheart," her mother said gently, brushing Emily's hair out of her face. "You're getting too old for dolls, that's all." Her father nodded in agreement, suggesting that maybe it was time to put the dolls away, to pack them up and move on from childish things. But Emily knew that wasn't the answer. The dolls weren't just toys, they were something much more sinister. One evening, after yet another sleepless night filled with whispered horrors, Emily decided to take matters into her own hands. She would prove to herself, and to her parents, that the dolls were behind the voices. She set up an old tape recorder she found in the attic, hiding it under a pile of clothes in her closet, aimed at her collection of dolls. As night fell and the house grew quiet, Emily lay in bed, wide awake, waiting for the whispers to start. Hours passed in tense silence, the darkness pressing in around her. Just as she began to drift into a restless sleep, the whispers began. They were louder this time, more insistent, as if they knew she was trying to capture them. "We know you're listening, Emily," they cooed, their voices intertwining in a haunting melody. Emily's breath caught in her throat, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure it would wake her parents. She lay perfectly still, barely daring to breathe, praying the recorder would catch every word. "Come and play, Emily," the voices sang, a twisted lullaby that sent shivers down her spine. "Come and see what lies beyond." The next morning, Emily rushed to retrieve the recorder, her hands trembling with anticipation. She rewound the tape, her heart racing as she hit play. At first, all she heard was the soft hum of static, the occasional creak of the house settling. But then, faintly at first, she heard it, the unmistakable sound of whispers. They were distant, almost inaudible, but they were there. Emily's eyes widened, a mix of fear and triumph washing over her. She wasn't crazy. The dolls were real, and they were talking to her. She played the tape for her parents, her hands shaking as she handed it over. Her mother listened intently, her brow furrowing, while her father shook his head in disbelief. "It's just noise, Emily," he said dismissively, handing the recorder back to her. "There's nothing there." Emily could see the worry in her mother's eyes, the way her hands trembled as she reached out to comfort her. "Maybe we should take you to see someone," her mother suggested gently, but Emily pulled away, frustration boiling over. "I'm not crazy," she shouted, tears streaming down her face. "The dolls are talking to me. They want me to do things, bad things." Her parents exchanged a worried glance, and her father gently took her by the shoulders. "Emily, we're just trying to help," he said softly. But Emily shook her head, pulling away from his grasp. "You don't understand," she whispered, her voice breaking. "None of you do." She ran up to her room, slamming the door behind her, and collapsed on her bed, her sobs muffled by her pillow. She was alone, truly alone, with only the whispers to keep her company. As the days turned into weeks, Emily's behavior grew more erratic. She began to sleepwalk, wandering the house in the middle of the night with a vacant expression on her face. Her parents would find her standing in the hallway, staring blankly at the walls, her lips moving silently as if she were speaking to someone they couldn't see. They tried everything, doctors, therapists, even a priest, but nothing could break the hold the dolls had on her. The whispers had become her constant companions, their dark secrets filling her mind until there was no room left for anything else. And then, one night, it happened. Emily woke to find her dolls arranged in a perfect circle around her bed, their glassy eyes staring up at her, their smiles frozen in eerie grins. Her breath hitched, a scream caught in her throat, as she realized what they were doing. They were trying to trap her, to keep her there with them forever. She stumbled out of bed, knocking over a lamp in her haste, and ran to the door. But as she reached for the handle, she felt a cold hand on her shoulder, pulling her back. She turned, her eyes wide with terror, and saw Clara, her favorite doll, standing on the edge of the bed, her eyes glowing with a sinister light. Emily's terror reached new heights after that night. Clara's glowing eyes were a vision she couldn't shake, a chilling reminder of the doll's growing power. She tried to stay away from her room, spending most of her time in the living room or the kitchen, but the whispers followed her everywhere. They no longer needed the darkness to haunt her. Even in the daylight, she could hear them, clearer than ever before, filling her mind with their ghastly secrets. The dolls' voices grew more distinct, more forceful, their messages no longer shrouded in cryptic whispers. They demanded things of her now, terrible things. They told her to hurt herself, to hurt others, to make sacrifices in their name. They promised her peace if she obeyed, but Emily resisted, clinging to the last shreds of her sanity. She tried to talk to her parents again, but they were at their wits' end. They had done everything they could think of, therapy, medication, even spiritual intervention, but nothing seemed to help. Her father began to lose his patience, while her mother could only cry, feeling helpless and afraid. One night, driven by desperation and exhaustion, Emily decided to confront the dolls directly. She stormed into her room, her heart pounding with fear and anger. "What do you want from me?" she screamed, her voice breaking with emotion. The room was silent for a moment, the air thick with tension. And then, in unison, the dolls spoke. "We want you, Emily," they said, their voices blending into a haunting chorus. "We want you to join us." Emily backed away, her hands trembling. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "I won't do it. I won't listen to you anymore." But the dolls only laughed, a sound that echoed off the walls, filling the room with a chilling sense of dread. Emily's sleep was plagued by nightmares, visions of the afterlife the dolls described. She saw endless corridors filled with shadows, heard the screams of the lost souls trapped there. She saw herself wandering these halls, her eyes empty, her body cold. Each night, the dreams grew more vivid, more terrifying, until she could no longer distinguish them from reality. She would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, her heart racing, convinced she was still trapped in that terrible place. The whispers began to guide her actions, compelling her to do things she couldn't understand. One evening, she found herself standing at the top of the staircase, holding Clara in her hands. The doll's eyes seemed to glow again, and Emily felt a strange compulsion to let go, to let Clara tumble down the stairs. But as she was about to release her grip, she snapped back to reality, horrified at what she was about to do. She threw the doll onto the floor and ran back to her room, slamming the door shut behind her. Determined to find a way out, Emily started researching the history of her house and the previous owners, hoping to find some explanation for the doll's behavior. She spent hours in the local library, poring over old newspapers and records. She learned that the house had belonged to a family decades ago, a family with a daughter who, like Emily, had been obsessed with dolls. The girl, it seemed, had gone mad, her mind broken by something no one could understand. She was found dead in her room, surrounded by her dolls, her face frozen in a look of terror. Emily's blood ran cold as she read the article, her hands shaking. It was happening again. Whatever had happened to that girl was happening to her. She rushed home, her heart pounding, determined to find more clues. She tore through her room, searching for anything that could help her understand what was happening. And that's when she found the diary, hidden behind a loose floorboard under her bed. The pages were yellowed and fragile, the ink faded with time, but as Emily read, she felt a chill run down her spine. The diary belonged to the girl who had lived in the house before her, a girl named Lila. The entries were filled with descriptions of the same things Emily was experiencing, the whispers, the visions, the compulsion to do terrible things. Lila wrote about the dolls as if they were alive, describing how they spoke to her, how they showed her things no one should ever see. The last entry was the most chilling of all. They want me to join them. They say there's a ritual, a way to bring them into our world. I don't want to do it, but they won't stop. I have to end this. I have to destroy them, before it's too late. Emily realized with horror that she was not the first to be haunted by the dolls, and she might not be the last. She was caught in a cycle, a curse that had claimed Lila and now threatened to claim her. The dolls were more than just toys, they were conduits for something evil, something that wanted to break free into the world of the living. Emily knew she had to act, but she was terrified. She didn't know if she had the strength to fight them, or if she would end up like Lila, a victim of the dolls' dark magic. The whispers became screams, urging Emily to perform the ritual, to give herself to them. She could feel her willpower waning, her mind slipping away, the line between reality and nightmare blurring beyond recognition. The dolls moved on their own now, their glassy eyes following her every move, their expressions shifting from placid smiles to sinister grins. The room felt alive, the walls closing in on her, the air thick with a malevolent presence. Emily knew she was running out of time. She had to find a way to stop them, to break the cycle, before it was too late. Emily clutched the diary to her chest, the weight of her decision pressing down on her like a physical force. She had to choose, fight the dolls and risk everything, or surrender to their demands and lose herself forever. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but she couldn't let the dolls win. She couldn't let them claim another life. She had to end this, once and for all. Emily knew she had no choice but to confront the truth about her dolls. She couldn't ignore the diary's warnings or the sinister history of her house. She felt a sense of urgency, a need to act quickly before she lost herself entirely to the voices. The next day, she returned to the library, desperate to find anything that could help her understand the ritual mentioned in Lila's diary. She searched through old books on folklore and dark magic, piecing together bits of information about spirits and possessions. The puzzle pieces slowly began to fit together, revealing a terrifying picture of what she was truly dealing with. It became clear that the dolls were a conduit for something much darker than she had ever imagined. They weren't just haunted, they were vessels, bound by a ritual to harbor lost souls seeking vengeance or release. The ritual was ancient, meant to bridge the gap between the living and the dead, allowing spirits to pass through. The dolls were a gateway, a doorway to the afterlife. And Emily realized with horror that they were trying to use her to open it. As she continued to research, she discovered a reference to a cleansing ritual, one that could potentially sever the bond between the dolls and the spirits they contained. It required fire, an element believed to purify and destroy the connection to the spirit world. But the ritual was dangerous, and the writings warned that if done incorrectly, it could backfire, releasing the spirits into the house instead of banishing them. Emily felt a cold shiver run down her spine as she read the warnings, but she knew she had no choice. She had to try. She couldn't let the dolls control her any longer. That night, she gathered everything she needed for the ritual: candles, salt, matches, and an old brass bowl she found in the attic. She drew a circle of salt around the dolls, placing each one carefully in the center, just as the instructions described. Her hands trembled as she lit the candles, their flickering flames casting eerie shadows on the walls. She took a deep breath, whispering a prayer under her breath, hoping she was doing the right thing. As she began to chant the words of the ritual, the room grew colder, the temperature dropping rapidly. The whispers started again, louder this time, filled with anger and desperation. "Stop," they hissed, their voices filled with malice. "You don't know what you're doing." Emily's heart raced, fear gripping her, but she pushed through, her voice growing louder, drowning out the whispers. She could feel a shift in the air, a change in the atmosphere, as if the room itself was alive and responding to her words. Suddenly, the dolls began to move, their heads turning slowly to face her, their eyes glowing with a malevolent light. The air grew thick with tension, and Emily could feel a dark energy building around her. She continued the ritual, her voice shaking but determined, as she took the matches and struck one against the box. The flame burst to life, and she held it over the bowl, preparing to drop it into the salt circle. But before she could release the match, the dolls began to speak, their voices no longer whispers but screams. "Emily," they shrieked, their voices a cacophony of pain and fury. "You will join us. You cannot break the bond." The force of their words knocked Emily back, her body slamming into the wall behind her. The match fell from her hand, landing just outside the circle. The flame flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness. Emily scrambled to her feet, her body trembling, her mind racing. She had to finish the ritual. She reached for another match, but the dolls moved again, sliding across the floor towards her, their eyes glowing brighter, their faces twisted into expressions of rage. She grabbed the matchbox with shaking hands, striking another match, but her fingers were slick with sweat, and the match slipped from her grasp. She realized with horror that the dolls were trying to stop her, to break her concentration, to keep her from completing the ritual. She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath, and focused on the chant, repeating the words over and over, trying to drown out the voices in her head. She could feel the power of the ritual building again, the energy crackling in the air around her. This time, she was ready. She struck the match and held it steady, her eyes fixed on the salt circle. The dolls screamed again, their voices piercing her mind, but she pushed through the pain, her focus unwavering. She dropped the match into the bowl, watching as the flame caught and spread, the fire growing and consuming the salt. The room filled with the smell of smoke and sulfur, the air thick with heat. For a moment, everything was still. The dolls stopped moving, their eyes dull and lifeless, their voices silent. Emily held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest, waiting for something to happen. Then, slowly, she felt it, a shift, a change in the air, as if a great weight had been lifted. The coldness that had filled the room began to fade, replaced by a warmth that spread through her body. Emily dared to hope that the ritual had worked, that the doll's hold on her had been broken. But as she stepped closer to the circle, she saw something that made her blood run cold. The doll's eyes were glowing again, but this time with a different light, a light that seemed to pulse and flicker like a heartbeat. She realized with a sickening feeling that the ritual hadn't destroyed the bond, it had strengthened it. The dolls began to laugh, a low, rumbling sound that filled the room with a sense of dread. "Thank you, Emily," they said in unison, their voices filled with a sinister glee. "You've given us exactly what we needed." Emily's eyes widened in horror as she realized what she had done. She had completed the ritual, but in doing so, she had opened the door even wider. The spirits were no longer trapped within the dolls. They were free to roam the house, free to do as they pleased. Emily stumbled back, her mind reeling, her heart racing. She had to get out. She had to leave the house before it was too late. But as she turned to run, she felt a cold hand on her shoulder, pulling her back. She turned, her eyes wide with terror, and saw Clara standing there, her eyes glowing with a sinister light, her face twisted into a smile that sent chills down Emily's spine. "Stay with us, Emily," Clara whispered, her voice soft and sweet, like a lullaby. "Stay with us forever." Emily's breath caught in her throat as Clara's icy grip tightened on her shoulder. Panic surged through her, every instinct screaming at her to run, to flee the house that had become a prison. But her legs felt like lead, her body frozen under the weight of Clara's gaze. The other dolls began to move toward her, their expressions shifting from eerie smiles to grotesque grins, their eyes glowing with a malevolent fire. Emily knew she had to act, and she had to act now. Summoning every ounce of courage she had left, Emily tore herself away from Clara's grasp and sprinted toward the door. She flung it open, only to be met with an invisible force slamming it shut in her face. She turned around, her back pressed against the door, watching in horror as the dolls closed in, their small bodies casting long shadows in the dim candlelight. The room felt alive with a dark energy, the air thick with the presence of something ancient and evil. "Please," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "Let me go. I don't want to be a part of this." The dolls paused, their heads tilting in unison as if considering her plea. But then Clara stepped forward, her porcelain face cracking slightly as she smiled wider, revealing tiny, jagged teeth behind her painted lips. "It's too late for that, Emily," she hissed. "You're one of us now." Emily felt a wave of despair wash over her, her knees buckling as she slid down the door, her heart pounding in her chest. She closed her eyes, trying to block out the sight of the dolls, their voices, their whispers. But then, a thought pierced through her fear, a memory of Lila's diary, of the final entry, and the warning it contained. The ritual had a failsafe, a last resort to seal the spirits away, but it came at a great cost. It required a sacrifice. Determined to end the nightmare, Emily scrambled to her feet and grabbed the diary from the floor, flipping to the last page. She read the words aloud, her voice shaking but growing stronger with each syllable. "By fire and blood, by salt and bone, I bind thee to this place. I seal thee away, never to return." As she spoke the final words, the dolls began to scream, their voices merging into a deafening wail that reverberated through the room. The air around her grew colder, and Emily could feel the dark energy swirling, fighting against the power of the incantation. She knew what she had to do, but her hands trembled at the thought. She reached for the brass bowl and the matches, her movements slow and deliberate. With a deep breath, she struck a match and held it over the bowl, her eyes fixed on Clara. "I'm sorry," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I have to end this." With a swift motion, she dropped the match into the bowl, watching as the flames roared to life, their light casting flickering shadows across the walls. She grabbed a shard of glass from the broken lamp and cut her palm, letting the blood drip into the fire. The flames hissed and spat, growing higher and more intense. Emily could feel the energy shifting, the dark presence recoiling from the fire's purifying heat. The dolls' screams grew louder, more frantic, as if they knew what was coming. Clara lunged at Emily, her tiny hands clawing at her, but Emily held her ground, chanting the words of the incantation over and over. By fire and blood, by salt and bone, I bind thee to this place. I seal thee away, never to return. The room shook violently, the walls creaking and groaning as if under immense pressure. The dolls were being pulled back, their bodies contorting and twisting, their faces frozen in expressions of rage and terror. Just as Emily thought she couldn't bear it any longer, there was a blinding flash of light, and a wave of heat washed over her, knocking her to the ground. The scream stopped abruptly, and a heavy silence fell over the room. Emily lay still, her body trembling, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Slowly, she opened her eyes, blinking against the bright light. The room was still and quiet, the dark energy gone, replaced by a strange sense of calm. She sat up slowly, looking around. The dolls lay scattered across the floor, their eyes dull and lifeless, their expressions blank. The fire had gone out, leaving only a thin wisp of smoke rising from the bowl. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she realized what she had done. She had sealed the spirits away, trapped them in the dolls, and ended their reign of terror. But she knew that she could never keep the dolls in the house. They were too dangerous. They needed to be destroyed. With the last of her strength, Emily gathered the dolls into a burlap sack, her hands shaking as she tied it shut. She stumbled down the stairs, out the front door, and into the backyard, where she dug a deep hole. She placed the sack in the hole, covering it with dirt and stones, and then poured gasoline over the spot. Striking another match, she tossed it onto the makeshift grave, watching as the flames consumed the earth, a final act of cleansing. Emily watched the fire burn, her body aching, her mind numb with exhaustion. As the last embers died away, she felt a strange sense of peace settle over her, a feeling she hadn't experienced in a long time. The nightmare was over. The dolls were gone. And she was free. Or so she thought. As she turned to go back into the house, she heard a faint whisper behind her, soft and familiar. She froze, her blood running cold. Slowly, she turned around, her eyes scanning the darkness. And then she saw it, just a glint, a flash of light reflecting off a pair of glassy eyes staring up at her from the edge of the woods. Clara's eyes. Emily's breath caught in her throat, a scream building in her chest, but no sound came out. She backed away slowly, her eyes never leaving the spot where she saw the eyes. And then, just as quickly as they appeared, they vanished, leaving her standing alone in the darkness, her heart racing, her mind spinning. Was it over? Was she truly free? Or had the dolls found a way back? She would never know. And that, perhaps, was the most terrifying thought of all.